Very good evening and a warm welcome to the Q&A session on patients' rights in education. Today with us we have Dr. Narayan Pense. Sir is an MD. Sir is an MD radiology. He's a director of operations in the King's Hospital, Colombo, Sri Lanka. He's also an advisor, medical strategy and operations, Fortis Healthcare India. Along with Dr. Narayan, we also have with us Dr. Lallu Joseph. Madam is a quality manager and an associate general superintendent of CMC Hospital. She is also the Secretary General CAHO. Welcome to Sir and Ma'am.
Thank you.
We have collated a few questions that were floated by all of you. So we will go one by one with the questions. Further, if you have any other queries, kindly put them in the chat box. We will take it up after the session.
Yeah. Thank you, Meenakshi. And thank you, Dr. Narayan, for joining with us all the way from Sri Lanka. Indeed, a pleasure having you, and your session was wonderful. So we have a lot of questions from our participants. We currently have about 40 to 45 participants who have joined. I'm sure we will have them all joining in. The recorded one will be circulated to all our online participants, which is about 583 of them. So I'll go ahead and start with the questions. Am I audible? Yeah.
Yes.
Perfect. Yeah. So the first question is about the HIV report. So I don't have the name of the person who's asked this question. The question is, can HIV report be a part of patient case file? In Medical College Hospital, how will the treating team or the referring doctor get information on the seropositive, the HIV status of the patient? Yeah.
Right. Thank you for the question. And I think before I get to the answer to the question, it's important to always remember that, what is the intent of any chapter or, any accreditation for that matter, or any standard or any objective element. And it's always important to understand the intent, because that is something which is actually going to be, that's the basis of any assessment, So coming specifically to this question about HIV, and it's interestingly, it doesn't talk about any other infection like COVID or, hepatitis B for that matter, but it talks about HIV. And it's a very important question. But why HIV specifically, and why has HIV caught so much of attention? Although there are more deadlier viruses compared to HIV, which have been around and are emerging. But there is a certain stigma which is associated with HIV, and that's why the importance, and that's why rather than discriminate people because of any particular lifestyle choices or behaviors which may be associated with their HIV positive status. That is the intent. That is the intent for what National AIDS Control Organization does. That is what some of the patient rights groups, etc., do. So it's important to remember the intent. Now, while it's important to know the intent, it's also an important information for the treating team, for the doctors and the nurses who are handling the patient. Although evidence about it is also a little contradictory, because where NACO and most of the other guidelines come from is that what additional are you supposed to do if a patient is HIV positive? I mean, you are anyway supposed to follow all the precautions, both from a staff and occupational safety point of view, as well as from a virus protection point of view. You are supposed to follow the standard precautions. You are supposed to follow hand hygiene. You are supposed to observe, and don personal protective equipment as and when it is required. So many times it is this fear of HIV. However, it is the prerogative of the treating team, and if the consent from the patient is taken for HIV testing, which is mandated as by law, if that information is there, it should definitely be kept in the case file. If a test has been done by consent of the patient and it is deemed important for treating purposes and for safety of the treating team, etc., if the test has been done, if the report is available, it has to be a part of the patient's case file. Now, having said that, what is the purpose of keeping a patient case file? The purpose is so that the treating team, doctors, nurses, whoever are involved in care, have access to the case file, they can make some documentations and their recordings of their clinical findings into that. And all the various test reports are available. A bedhead ticket or a medical case file is not a general public viewing document. It is kept at the nursing station or at the patient's bedside, and it is to be accessed and used only by a few individuals who are concerned in the care of that particular patient. So per se, an HIV test can be a part of a patient's case file, provided that the HIV test has been done following the proper risk estimation and with consent of the patient. However, if the patient has expressed a specific choice or concern, then we need to be acting accordingly. So please remember that what is the purpose of doing the test, what is the purpose of sharing that information, that is the most important thing, and accordingly we need to decide on that. So there is no standard, there is no objective element, there is no law which says you cannot keep a patient's HIV report in the patient's case file. Lalu madam, would you like to add anything based on your experience?
Yes, definitely, because what is clearly told by most of the assessors and also the NABL and other assessment process is that it is only the treating clinician who is actually ordering for the test has the right to see the positive or the negative status of the patient. And what is in fact done in practice is that the negative result or the positive result is not sent to the ward, or it is not put in the clinical workstation for any doctor to access. So typically it goes in a cover, in a sealed envelope to the treating clinician, and the treating clinician, if it is positive, then it is his responsibility to counsel the patient and inform. Or you have your NACO center, then your psychologists and counselors come into the picture. So that's the typical process that is adopted in most hospitals, though it is only a guideline that we are talking about, NACO guideline. It is not about a mandatory statutory requirement that we are talking about. Guideline is something as a best practice that for all of us to follow. And other thing is it cannot be mandatorily implemented. It is a good practice. So all these things have come into picture because of the stigma associated with it. However, I would say it is all universal precaution. Now, if you realize it's standard precaution that needs to be adopted for all patients, anybody could turn positive during the window period. So it is important to follow that. And in many hospitals, if everybody comes to know, then what happens? There is a bucket that is kept. The next question is actually on that. How does a launderer know that this patient is HIV positive or negative? He doesn't need to know at all whether the patient is positive or negative. So we have also seen hospitals where there are buckets separately kept for HIV linen, HIV waste, HIV patient, and there is a red sticker that is put on the bedside of the patient, or a big red bindi that is put on top of the patient case files. So in order to avoid all these is probably why this practice of an envelope, a sealed cover that goes to the treating clinician. I mean, that's what I have found, Dr. Narayan. You're the expert. You could probably add on more to that. Yeah.
Yeah, coming to the part about, laundry and linen, etc. Now, what infection, if you refer to any CDC or WHO or any other, I mean, even if we use, let's say, our common sense, what additional are you going to do for a patient who is HIV positive versus, let's say, a Hep B positive, patient, for example? So it's not only about HIV, first of all. If there is, the hospital is expected to have a policy on how to handle the various types of linen. So if the linen is soiled or contaminated or potentially infectious, then what is the method to be followed? That is most important. And by following standard precautions at all time, there is nothing additional which is required. Now, there is always a gap between theory and practice, which is bound to be, particularly since the question also talks about medical college hospitals, where obviously there are junior doctors and others who are also involved in treatment of the the patient, and these are the opportunities for learning also. So it really depends on how the information needs to be passed on, with whom it gets shared, and the hospital is expected to have a policy and a practice around this. The most important thing is a patient should not be discriminated basis the HIV report. That is fundamental. That is the most important thing to be, and that is what actually the assessors are interested in. And of course, it's confidential medical information. So it should not be easily available to anybody who is not part of the treating team.
Absolutely. I think that gives the answer to it all. The most important thing is the health information. Who can access it? And that is typically the protocol that you need to establish in your hospital. I come from a teaching medical college hospital. It is not possible for only the consultant to actually see the result. So therefore, the entire treating team, all doctors actually have the access to the report of the patient. That is how it is done. Otherwise, you really cannot have confidentiality in these aspects as long as you don't discriminate them. I think that's the most important thing to follow. Don't discriminate. There are deadlier viruses and other things to bother about. It is no longer a stigma is what I feel. I don't know how it is in other parts of the country. So with that, I think we'll also take on
In fact, if I may just kind of, add one sentence, the modern antiretroviral therapy is so effective that even if a patient is HIV positive, it really doesn't mean anything because, they are not replicating and shedding viruses as was, thought much earlier. In fact, there are, like I said, there are other viruses which are more important and deadlier. Sorry, over to you again, madam. Yes.
No, absolutely fine. This is just a conversation we are going to be having more than a Q&A session. And I would urge the participants also to put in your queries as you find. If we are, as we are discussing, if you have more queries, please put them down. Now, in line with the same question, sir, as you said, do not write on cover of the HIV positive or the file of the HIV positive. So I just want to know what should be on the file cover or on samples or on laundry of patients to identify that it's positive patient sample or positive patient linen. So this is typically what we answered some time back. Anyway, you can reiterate on that. Yeah.
So any, any identifier, something like a biohazard sticker or something like that, which is kind of known to the people who are handling, the file, that can be used. But again, what is important is it should not lead to any discrimination. That is the most important thing. Now, what can be an identifier? Now, people have asked whether we can put a red dot on the file to kind of identify. That's okay. I mean, you can do, but what is the purpose? Why would you want to do that? That's the fundamental question. What additional or extra are you going to do if there is a red dot on the file? I mean, that's, if somebody can answer to, our satisfaction, that what is the purpose? So if it is not serving any purpose, then what is the point in putting that red dot or, any green dot or, whatever logo or symbol you might put? So it is meaningless to do that, because the moment you start doing that, it is bound to lead to discrimination. And that is the most important part, because that is when actually the spirit of, patient care and patient rights also gets violated. So if it is not serving any purpose, okay, information should be there with the treating doctor if it is relevant to that particular case. Let's say for, some major surgery is going to happen, etc. Even there, the evidence is very debatable whether it is justified or not. But okay, if somebody wants to take that extra precaution and it is done with the consent of the patient, that part is understandable. But anything which leads to discrimination should not be used, and it is not serving any additional medical purpose. There is no scientific evidence to say that by putting a red dot on the file, the chances of infection being passed on to other, to staff or etc. Increase or decrease by doing that. So there is no merit in doing that.
Absolutely. So with regards to linen handling, I think only two categories of linen. It is not infected and non-infected linen. We must understand that. It is either wet linen or dry linen. So all patients are potentially infectious. That's it. So it is either dry or wet. If it is dry linen, you send them directly to the laundry. If it is wet linen with motion, pus, blood stain, whatever, you need to disinfect with 1% hypochlorite or whatever chemical that you all are going to use for 20 minutes, then you send it. So it is a preliminary treatment that you are doing before you send it to the laundry. That again, there is a purpose, because the laundry people may not be so educated and they may dump everything all together. They may be handling that without using protective gear. So you disinfect and then you send. There are many hospitals that don't do that. They send it directly to the laundry. There are sluice tanks there where it is disinfected. It's up to you. But there is no way that you're going to segregate it as infected linen and non-infected linen, because every patient is a potential biohazard. So that is the logic which we need to adopt. So
in fact, the definition of standard precaution itself is very clear on this, that, you know, whether confirmed or potential, etc., they are all, you know, standard precautions means standard precautions. They are to be followed at all times. And those are the only precautions which will help prevent the spread of, you know, viruses of any kind or any infectious material for that case. So linen, like Madam correctly says, I mean, all linen which is soiled is potentially, you know, infectious. So accordingly, it has to be dealt with.
Absolutely. So we'll move on to the next one. This is about COVID. In COVID ward, is it necessary to take signature of witness as minimum staff are working in patient care areas? I think this is probably about the consent from where it has come. COVID ward, is it necessary to take signature of witness as minimum staff are working in patient care areas? Yeah.
That's an interesting question. So, but again, we need to get back to, you know, what is the requirement or what is the intent, you know, behind the standard and the objective element, as well as the practice of consent. Now, what is a consent? Who is giving consent to whom? You know, usually in terms, if you see technically, a consent is an agreement kind of between two parties which are unrelated. And it's like a contract. It comes under the Contract Act actually. And the witness only witnesses the act of consent taking. The witness is not an expert in, you know, medicine or anything else. Is not expected to be. So what is important is that the witness is witnessing the process of consent taking, and that some information has been exchanged between the doctor and the patient, or the treating team and the patient, and that he or she has witnessed it. Now, COVID or non-COVID, if you strictly go by the law, the law goes by document. You may have followed everything, communicated everything, but if the documentation is not adequate, it will be held against you. So it is always a good practice, not a good practice. It's a recommendation that consent has to be there with a witness in any situation. If it's a life-threatening, you know, situation or something like that, there are provisions to kind of bypass some of the requirements. But in a COVID ward, it does not mean that as a blanket, you know, we do not take consent. We do not witness the consent. Consent should be taken, and witness signature should be there. Who can be a witness? Again, there are no easy answers for this, because ideally it should be an unrelated party or a third party. In a hospital, it's practically impossible to go and find third parties, because it's either the staff members or the patient or his or her attendant most of the times who are there. But as long as there is somebody who witnesses the act of consent and is putting his or her signature, that is the requirement. And even in a COVID ward, from a legal perspective, it should be followed. From an operational perspective, from a practical perspective, if there are any situations, there is no harm in the staff member himself or herself, signing on a witness, provided he or she has witnessed the act of the information exchange and the consent practice.
Absolutely. So I think I'll also add on a little more to this. So COVID is something that has come up now, and potentially, if you look at it, most hospitals, what do? When the patient gets admitted, they take a general consent on admission. And there it is clearly spelled out the kind of, norms that need to be followed, and no relatives. See, there are typically very peculiar situations happening now. A lady is admitted, she has to deliver 2 days later, and she's COVID positive. She cannot have a relative accompanying her. Of course, now government has allowed. Now there is another consent for that, stating that I am fully aware that I may potentially become COVID positive, but yet I am agreeing to be with this patient because the patient requires a relative. To that complex situation it has gone to now. And what if the lady has to go in for a cesarean? Then there is a consent very clearly spelling out the risks, benefits and alternatives of LSCS procedure, and along with that, with the COVID. So I think consent, yes, all of us are taking. With regards to this witness part, I don't think many of us have really focused much on it, because it's a very peculiar situation where the relatives are not with them. What generally we are doing is, you call the relatives, do a video consulting with them, counseling them as well, informing them this is what is happening, and make sure that they are also completely aware of what is happening. Witness is generally one of the staff nurses or somebody who's on the floor, who's witnessing on behalf of the, as a, what do I say, along with the patient, they are also there. But it's a very, very peculiar situation. I don't think we should be too worried about it, is my, there are better things to worry about at this point in time rather than really focusing much on this witness part of it. As long as we take a consent and do what is needed, I presume it is okay. It is a good practice to also have a witness signing. Doctor, you want to add on, Dr. Narayan?
Only that if possible, and it's a good practice that if a witness is not available, there is no harm in documenting that. Okay, given the situation and the restrictions which are there, that no witness was available. Even that is okay.
Yeah.
As long as it's to document and prove your spirit and intent that okay, exigencies did not permit you to complete the witness part, but you thought about it and you have documented it. That would be ideal if it can be done.
True. So let's move on to another question on consent. I think many questions are on consent. Now, this is a very interesting one. In Punjab, the language used by people is Punjabi. And you said the consent should be bilingual. So consent in English and Punjabi is what they have. But we receive patient who understands only Hindi and Pahadi language. Yeah. So in this case, what should we do? Should we involve an interpreter signature in this, or we need to design consent in Hindi too? So you'll need, what do you think?
So it really depends on how many people do you frequently get, how many patients do you get who do not understand English or Punjabi. I mean, if it's a frequent thing and there are quite a few people who understand only Hindi, for example, or Pahadi language, for example, if your patient base or quite a few of your patients come from that area, then you may wish to consider having a form in English or Pahadi language also. It is not necessary. It is not mandated. But what is important, again, what is the intent? The intent is that whatever matter is written on the form is explained to the patient or the family or the attendant in a manner and in a language which they understand. Now, if a patient or the family does not understand English or Punjabi, obviously we need to make some arrangement by which it can be, suppose the patient and family understand only Hindi, then if some person, maybe a staff member, most of the times it is a staff member who understands, who can communicate well in Hindi, explains what is there to the patients and the attendants. If that is manageable and if you can make sure that some staff member is available at short notice to do the needful, that is not a problem. You do not necessarily have to print forms in Hindi or Pahadi language. But if it's a frequent, if say daily you are having a few patients and this problem is coming in, you may wish to consider getting the forms printed. They may be printed on demand. I mean, many times you can keep a soft copy, and if it is needed, and if you have a printer available sometime in somewhere in close vicinity, you can even do that. That's not a problem. So it's not mandatory to print in the third language. But it's an operational decision which you need to take. If you have a significant number of patients coming from that belt or that language, you may want to do so. If not, making sure that there is an interpreter and that interpreter explains in the proper manner and also signs on the consent form along with whatever date, time, etc. is required, that will meet the requirement of the objective.
Yeah, I think that's very clear. In a setup like ours, we get patients from all over the country. So what actually we have done is we do have consent forms available in multiple languages, as Dr. Narayan rightly said. Depending on whether they, I mean, let's say somebody comes from Andhra and they don't speak English at all and they don't understand, then in that case the Telugu form is used. Otherwise it is explained in English. And if the interpreter is used, it's generally written down that the interpreter explained in the language Telugu that the patient understands, and that interpreter actually signs in that. So that is all exclusively your protocols. The law doesn't stipulate that this is how you need to do it. So how you put down as your standard operating procedure, you follow that and make sure that everybody follows the protocol in the hospital. If that is not done, and if it is individually done for different departments, then it becomes a problem. So typically the aspects of consent bilingual is mandatory. that is something which we need to adhere to. After that, 12 languages, 15 languages, it is up to us, depending on the clientele that we get. So I think we need to be clear on that. The mother tongue, the language of the land, plus English, plus Hindi, plus what you want. That can be done according to your thing. But it's quite tricky, you know, a lot of questions on consents. So you're going to be answering consent and consent, Dr. Narayan. So I thought to steer that a little bit aside, let's go to something about patient experience. There are a lot of questions on experience as well. So there are about 7 questions on patient experience and a couple of them on patient feedback. So the first thing is, kindly could you clarify how patient experiences should be captured apart from patient feedback form? So what is the difference between a patient experiences and patient feedback is what I presume that the person is asking. If you could elaborate on that, please.
Okay, so I think most importantly, before I answer specifically the question, let's just take an example. Suppose many of you would have gone to say museums or other places, and there is a visitor book which is kept at some of these places where people write in a descriptive manner. Or suppose you have to go on an outing, say to a resort or to a restaurant or something. Many times we check Google reviews or TripAdvisor and some of these. Now imagine if in place of that resort or that hotel or restaurant was just putting up their feedback forms for you to kind of see. Would you be able to make a decision based on the feedback forms? Well, you could, but it would probably be much more difficult rather than reading a descriptive experience which the individual has had. That in essence is the difference between a feedback and an experience. Coming specifically to let's say healthcare, for example, or hospitals, a feedback basically evaluates whether your expectation was met or not met. That's about it. It can be done by means of, most of the times it's a questionnaire based, where you can kind of on a scale of 1 to 5 or 1 to 10 or using smiley faces, etc. You can broadly categorize, and some of the key questions can simply be checked or ticked, as they say, and you can convert it into a score, etc., etc. But it really does not capture the entire journey of the patient, or the entire experience of the patient. And this is becoming important because as the care becomes more patient centric, as we have more and more patient engagement, it is now becoming important, and that's why this standard specifically has now been introduced in the 5th edition. It was not there earlier, because what we realized was that patient feedback is important, and this is no way as meant to replace patient feedback or patient satisfaction surveys, etc. But here the idea is to capture as far as possible, in as many cases as possible, the entire experience of the patient. Now for a patient, the experience may start even before the patient is physically admitted to the hospital. For example, setting up an appointment, or reaching the hospital, for example, or let's say finding a parking space when you go to a hospital. It may be a problem in today's time, lack of adequate signages, for example. So the patient's experience actually starts much before and lasts much after actually the patient has even been discharged from the hospital. For example, the post-discharge instructions, care instructions, for example, whether they were given properly or not, and whether they were relevant to the patient or not, or whether they were understandable, etc. or not. Capturing each and every dimension or element of care on a patient feedback form is next to impossible. And that is the reason why specifically patient experience has now been brought in. In fact, there is a very short document which I have shared with Meenakshi, and I think she can flash it. It's from AHRQ. It's a very good resource for quality and patient safety documents. We can push the document to all of you maybe after the Q&A session is over. And that explains some of these things, that how patient experience is different from patient satisfaction. And you can also refer to some of the learning resources which are available there. in today, it's also important to remember in today's time that most important things from a patient point of view is how health information is shared with the patient. Most of the patients in today's times have comorbidities. There are teams of doctors who are training them. In fact, there's a question which I think it will come about multidisciplinary care and multidisciplinary counseling. We'll talk about that. But again, those points are very difficult to capture on a patient feedback form, because a feedback form only captures information in a semi-objective or objective manner about specific elements of care. It cannot be as descriptive, and the patient cannot narrate his or her experience in the manner that is now becoming important. So maybe we can just very quickly rush through this document. Meenakshi, if you could scroll to the top of the document, please. So like I said, this is from AHRQ. It's a very, very, reputed organization it's Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. And it talks about patient experience, that it encompasses the range of interactions that patients have with the healthcare system, including their care from health plans and from doctors, nurses, staff, etc. And that understanding patient experience is a key step in moving towards patient-centered care. So I'm not going to read through the entire document. At your time and leisure, you can go through it. It's a nice, concise document, and it also gives you various links to refer to specifically for this. I'm sure Lalu Madam would want to add something to patient experience.
Yeah, I think this document is very important, particularly the difference. If you can go up slightly, Meenakshi, on the difference between satisfaction and experience. Patient feedback, yeah, no, come down. How patient experience differs from patient satisfaction. I think this is what is most important. Though they are used interchangeably, I think Meenakshi has gone down. Yeah, this difference exactly. But they are not the same thing. To assess patient experience, one must find out from patients whether something that should happen in a healthcare setting actually happened, or how often it happened. I think that is what is most important. Now, there is something known as I always say this, quality is stated and implied needs of the patients. Now, when we talk about stated need, it is what the patient tells you. I just want to get better. That is what the patient tells you. But implied needs are far too many. He wants to be communicated. He wants to be told. He wants to be educated. He wants the doctors to smile, talk to him politely, nurses to explain, the ambience to be good. So a lot more that the patient expects out of the healthcare delivery beyond what he exactly explicitly states. So those are the implied needs. The perception in the minds of the patients is what we are trying to see, which is there is a gap between what the patient perceives as what he wants and what he actually gets. So is there a gap in the delivery? That is also something that we need to capture, because your clientele that comes is probably from the Tatas and Birlas to the next door neighbors who are in the slums. So you will need to cater to the experience that is desired. So whether you are matching their experiences, what they actually want, is there a gap, is something that you need to really understand. And I think it is a good move that this has also come into the picture now, just collecting some feedback forms and trying to understand, okay, 90% of my patients are satisfied. Great, they are satisfied. To what level is the satisfaction? Have they really got what they wanted? That is what your experience will actually bring out. And I did a survey recently. There are two methods I assessed. It's getting published now, in the journal. So what we did is we took random active and passive surveillance, like the way we do active and passive surveillance of our infection control practices. We actually did an active and passive surveillance with the same feedback form. Active forms, basically our feedback staff went and collected the feedback. Passive forms, the same forms were put in the box somewhere close to where the patients were sitting, and they filled the forms and put it down. So we actually looked at the difference between the active and the passively collected forms. Huge difference in what the patients had put down. So different methodology, different experiences is what we need to capture. Otherwise, it is just a monotonous exercise. Okay, somebody goes, distributes some feedback form, and somebody is making a presentation, 90% of my patients are satisfied. Invariably, they're not satisfied with the food, they're not satisfied with the toilets, and they're happy with the doctors, they're happy with the nurses. I think that doesn't really bring out anything. So the experience is what really matters. So we need to now move from, this is a excellence
Can I
point.
just take 5 more seconds, madam?
Yes, please, sir.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it also depends on the type of question being asked. For example, let's say if I was to ask, was the washroom clean? And say, okay, rate on the scale of 1 to 5. Probably I can do that. Okay. But if suppose I ask a question, was your care coordinated during your stay in the hospital? On a scale of 1 to 5, please answer that. Is it even possible to answer that question? Because it's impossible to do that. So you will have to, look at a more descriptive answer for questions like that. And that's very important because coordinated or, lack of coordinated care or lack of proper communication from patients or within the treating teams, etc., is one of the major concerns for patients and families. So that's the reason for moving now beyond simply capturing patient satisfaction, like Lalu madam also said, and move towards capturing, it's like capturing 360-degree rather than only capturing some part specifically, let's say for housekeeping or some of the other things which can be captured using direct question method on a patient satisfaction tool.
Yes. So the next one is also on that, sir. How to develop a checklist for capturing patient experience in hospital, whether it should be different from patient satisfaction criteria or not. I think we have answered that, isn't it?
Yeah. I think to a great extent we have already covered. Now, what is the mechanism that you want to employ to capture patient experience? That is something which the hospital will have to think about and develop. It could be based on, let's say, a survey. It could be based on a sample. And accordingly, there could be somebody who is tasked. It may be done using the interview method. You may even record if the patient consents to kind of do that, etc. So those ways and means of capturing patient experience, I think they depend on the hospital, the culture, and other factors, comfort of the patients in sharing their experiences, etc. And those will have to be evolved as we go along.
Absolutely. The third one, what are the components that NABH looks for with regards to patient feedback? Please elaborate.
So I think when I started today's session, the first thing I said was that, what is the intent? So what NABH wants to know, what any assessor wants to know is what is the intent of, capturing patient experience, and are you capturing patient experience simply to please the assessor, or are you doing with the spirit of improving your quality of care? That is most important. That's what the assessor is interested in. But of course, it is expected that the hospital should have a proper policy and a process to be put into place. There are people who are expected to be aware and whose job it would be, to collect patient experience. And then most importantly, not only to collect patient experience for, filling papers, but rather analyze it and then accordingly take up the, corrective actions which need to be put into place. That is what NABH is interested in, or any assessor is who represents NABH is interested in.
Absolutely. I think that's perfect. Now, moving on to the other one, I think this is quite interesting. Feedback and complaints are reviewed within a defined time frame. Please elaborate on the defined time frame.
So, I'm a radiologist by training and qualification. And in radiology, there is a concept called ALARA, ALARA, which is as low as reasonably achievable. That's used in the context of radiation safety. But in terms of, timeliness or response to feedback, I would say it should be as fast as reasonably possible, right? It really depends on the type of feedback. If it is a feedback which requires immediate and urgent action, correction and corrective action, there is no point in having a policy which says, okay, within 7 days or 14 days or 3 days or, whatever it might be. But whatever time period we are putting, it has to be based on a reasonable time period. Usually, most of the hospitals would go by a few days, let's say 7 days or something like that. But there has to be a mechanism by which feedback, based on which some urgent or immediate corrective action or correction has to take place. That should be prioritized and taken up. There we can't say that, okay, because I have 7 days, so something which I should be responding within 12 hours or 6 hours or etc., I am putting it under that guard. So there is no defined time period by NABH, but it has to be a reasonable time period. I think that is the key word, with a mechanism to prioritize corrective action if the feedback so requires.
That's purely the decision of the hospital administration and the hospital. But as sir rightly said, it is good to categorize them as probably, critical, vital, essential, desirable kind of a thing. And what is vital needs to be addressed immediately. Somebody is complaining that there is a big problem and which needs to be addressed immediately, then it should be addressed immediately. Then you can't say my hospital policy is 48 hours, I'll address it within 48 hours. So I think that should be the way in which you categorize and try and address them. Now, how to handle how to document and handle the telephonic complaints made by the patients or relatives, how to handle anonymous complaints.
Okay, so I mean, NABH has not, mandated any specific way. Again, what is the intent of capturing, a complaint which is received on telephone or anonymously? Number one, it has to be given the same importance as it would be by somebody who is willing to share his or her details. Because what we are looking at is not the identity of the person who is sharing the complaint. What is more important is what is the nature of the complaint. What is it that is deficient in our care or in our quality of, the facility or patient care, etc. That is most important. But if there is, it is at least expected that even if there is a telephonic complaint, then who has received that complaint? There has to be some documentation about what was the date and time when that complaint was received, who has received that complaint. There has to be some mechanism. If it's a bigger one of those hospitals who have call center or a dedicated line or an email, etc., there are various mechanisms by which complaints can come in. But what happened after the complaint was received, who was it communicated to, who has analyzed and taken the action, that is more important. Anonymous complaints, again, it's a standard practice nowadays almost that it's not mandatory. In fact, most of the complaint and feedback forms also say that, if you wish to share your name and email, etc., or can we contact you in case there is something, then patients or visitors may be willing to share that detail. But what is important is what is the nature of complaint and taking action on that complaint. That is most important. And some process and practice to be put into place about capturing all types of complaints which are received. They may be email, they may be WhatsApp, they may be telephonic, etc.
Perfect. Now the other one is also related to this. What is the frequency of reviewing the feedback and complaints from the patients? Suggest an ideal time frame and suggest some ideas of good practice on the same.
Yeah. So ideal time frame, again, I mean, it really depends on the type of facility and the type of patients, etc., that we are catering to, and also on the type of complaints and the feedback that we are receiving. Typically, like I was telling you earlier, the feedback forms are analyzed. At least the initial scrutiny is done, very, very quickly, say within 24 hours or 48 hours max. I mean, depending on the size of the hospital and the number of people available. So it's not like a one glove fits all approach to all the hospitals, cannot be. But like I said, it should be within a reasonable time frame. Typically, it would be, let's say, 24 to 48 hours. But like Madam pointed out earlier, there has to be a mechanism by which we can prioritize, on basis on criticality, and the correction and the corrective action has to take place. Who does that? It again depends on how many people and staff, etc., are available to be able to handle the feedback and the complaint mechanism.
That's very true. And I would also want to add on, when you're talking about good practices, typically I found this very interesting concept in one of the hospitals in Delhi, where the patient bedside had the display of one contact number with the name of the person, let's say Dr. So-and-so, and with a mobile number that stated, I am your mentor or I am your partner during your stay here. In case you have any grievances, any complaints, kindly call me immediately. And that is one doctor who had volunteered to do that for that one patient. So I happened to ask them, do you get very frequent complaints? And he said, in the last 3 months, I've got one person calling me over the phone. But that gives a feeling to the patient that, they have somebody to call to in case they have some problems. So, there are various methods adopted by hospitals to eliminate or reduce the kind of complaints. And so there is a buddy kind of a system and you have somebody to talk to. Rather than getting complaints, I think we'll have to work around the system so that we don't have many complaints also coming, which is impossible, I'm sure. Dr. Mohan Adiyam has added a question here, Dr. Narayan. In the case of anonymous complaints, it is necessary to capture the details as much as possible, as we may not be able to contact the complainant later for clarifications or supplementary questions. Frequency may also depend on the number of complaints received. More complaints, more frequent should be the review. So that's more to add on to our answers.
Absolutely agree with you, sir. In fact, as far as anonymous complaints are concerned, it's always a good practice to ask if the person doesn't wish to share his or her, name and contact details, etc. It would help if we ask, okay, what is the reason why you don't want your name and contact to be shared? Is there any specific reason? Because if too many anonymous complaints are being received, it means that there is something wrong and needs to be fixed. Maybe the culture of the organization, or people are fearful. It needs to be investigated. If it's some one of this thing, that's a separate thing. But if it's a repeated pattern, we need to really assess that. And anonymous complaints, like sir also mentioned, and madam also, that they are to be given the same weight, rather in fact even more weightage as compared to sometimes the regular complaints.
I think now we'll move away from complaints before people start complaining about us. Let's move on to something about documents. So there are two questions on that, Dr. Narayan. One is, every now and then patients fight with our staff for original documents of IPD after surgery. Patients want those documents. We provide the photocopies. So I want to know if is there any law or written document by Government of India that the original document is the property of the patients? That is one. And in line with that, there is another question as well. The access to patients' clinical records are not provided to the patients generally. Can you please explain on the way of providing access to their clinical records?
Right. So what is the medical record, or what is the clinical case file? I mean, it's simply a document which captures the journey of the patient, why the patient was admitted to the hospital, who were the caregivers, what was the clinical condition at the time of admission, what was the reason of admission, what was the care plan, what happened, what were the sequence of events, and all that gets documented till the time that the patient leaves the hospital. Who is the medical record intended for? Primarily, it is intended for caregivers, for the hospital staff and the treating team specifically, to be able to document it. Patients have a right to their medical records. The Medical Council of India, the Code of Ethics, is very clear in terms of that, and there are various other regulations and gazette recommendations, gazette notifications which are in place. In fact, a patient can request a copy of the medical record, and within 72 hours, we are duty bound to provide a copy of the medical record. A copy of the medical record. That's what it says. The usual practice is at the time of discharge, or in case of death, unfortunately, there is a discharge summary or a death summary which gets prepared, and that summary essentially encapsulates the journey of the patient in a brief manner. It's kind of synopsis of what has happened to the patient, and most of the times that itself is enough. In case a patient is being referred or transferred to any other hospital, etc., higher center, then again a transfer summary has to be made, and there NABH standards and objective elements also talk about what I'm just telling you. Now, like I said, patients definitely have a right to their medical records. Sometimes the situations are operationally a little challenging, because while the patient is admitted, it's a common thing. Somebody may say, okay, I want to take a copy, or I want to take a picture of my record and I want to send it to my nephew who is a doctor practicing somewhere else, etc. Can one do it? Should one do it? I think these are difficult questions to answer, because it also depends on the situation. But most important thing is engaging with the patient and the patient's family. That is most important. We can ask what is the purpose. We can facilitate the type of information that you require. For example, if somebody says that I want to share the details of the case file with, let's say, my nephew who is a doctor, it is best to handle this situation by saying we are happy to facilitate that, but it is impractical for you to kind of do that. We will prepare a summary, and our doctors can prepare a summary for you, and you can send that case summary to your nephew or whoever. We can facilitate by means of, if they have any questions, that they can call us, or we'll enable to have a discussion with the clinical team. So it is basically about communication and coordination, rather than whether an absolute right is there. Absolute right per se is there, because you can't deny giving a case file to the patient. Ultimately, the autonomy and self-determination lies with the patient. That is also very clear. Increasingly, the decision-making power is moving, rightly so, because earlier it was a paternalistic system where the doctor would largely decide what is good for the patient and say, okay, this is, you have to undergo surgery tomorrow, and this is, at 8 o'clock we come to the get admitted and we'll do surgery. But today's time, it doesn't work, because you have to explain the various choices, what are the options available, etc., pros and cons, and let the patient decide what is happening. So similarly, even for a clinical case file or a clinical case record, in terms of absolute requirement, patient has a right. Does patient have a legal right? Yes, patient has a legal right to get a copy of the medical record, and what health information to share and how to share. If we can facilitate that, it is in the interest of both the hospital as well as the patient, and also of the entire treating team.
That's beautifully answered. As long as you can explain to them, we tend to think that most of these patients, when they ask, it is for some legal opinion that they are going to take. Generally, it is not so. 100 patients you give, it is probably not even 1% who will go to the court. It is just that they want more information and they want the entire case file, a copy of that. So if you are able to explain, allay their anxiety and tell them that we are able to provide a summary, most of them will not even ask for it. And you're allowed to charge for it as well. You can take a photocopy of that. Ideally, yes, within 72 hours, you'll have to provide photocopy, and with the signature of the head of the institution, the medical director, then it has to be handed over, ideally within 72 hours. So Dr. Saxena has put in a question here. Some important documents are stolen by the patients and their attendants from medical records, or they prepare the duplicate documents to get the compensation. Is it a violation of patient right, and is it a punishable act?
Well, if the patient himself or herself is, the patient himself or herself can't steal his or her own records, because he already has a legal, access and a right to access the records. If they are used for any nefarious purposes by the patient himself, well, that's not a violation of the patient right. In fact, that is something which is, the hospital can claim that, these are not intended for whatever the nefarious activity the patient is engaging in. So it's not a violation of the patient right per se, but rather it's an act on part of the patient, knowingly or unknowingly, for which he or she may be punishable depending on what that particular action is.
Now I think we'll go on now to concerns again, Dr. Narayan. Specific situation-based concerns. We do retina injections in OT for our ophthalmic setup. Mostly 4 injections are advisable for a patient, and almost every month consent regarding the same is obtained every time. So I want to know, for same procedure, how long is the consent valid? Basically, I think they're asking, is it necessary to take the consent every time? Because 4 injections are given in a month. And what is the validity of the consent? Yes.
Yeah, I think similar situations come for, let's say dialysis is a classic example, and, sometimes chemotherapy or radiation therapy, etc. Also, these kind of situations do come. Now, what is most important in consent? What is most important in consent is the information which is embedded in the consent and, communicated to the patient. Specifically talking about details of the procedure, specifically talking about the risks that the procedure carries, and of course about the benefits and alternative therapies which may be available. Now, in the case of dialysis or the example that you just gave, number one, it is important when the first time the consent is taken. If we know, for example, that 4 sessions will be carried out for say retinal injections, or say these many sessions of dialysis are planned, etc. The first time that the consent is taken, it should detail out very clearly what is the plan for that particular therapy or that particular activity. If the risk does not change over a period of time, the same consent can be endorsed each time by the patient, each and every time the patient comes for getting that therapy. But if there is a risk element which can change or will change or is likely to change, it is better to take a fresh consent every time. Or if the initial consent is being endorsed, but at some stage the risk matrix changes, it is required that a fresh consent be taken. The maximum time period, even in a case of dialysis, etc., is 6 months.
So that you have answered the next question, which is for how many days the dialysis consent is valid. So I think that
it is maximum 6 months, and the key word is maximum, because like I said, if there are some new factors which have come up and which may have a bearing on the patient's treatment or on the risk, then a fresh consent must be taken. If the risk is unchanged, then it needs to be endorsed each time, and maximum 6 months is the period.
Yeah. The other thing is again on signature part, or who's taking the consent. If a multidisciplinary team of surgeons perform a surgery, so we assume that it is probably multiple departments operating on the same patient at the same time, should all the doctors sign the consent? It's probably all teams signing the consent, or the signature of the principal surgeon is enough?
So increasingly we are moving towards team-based care, and in teaching hospitals, etc. Also there are various people who are responsible. Now, what is required basically is that who is going to carry out the procedure, that needs to be captured very clearly. If there are 3 specialties who are going to be involved, let's say if I am doing a skull-based surgery and I need a neurosurgeon as well as a ENT surgeon, and maybe let's throw in a plastic surgeon for good measure. Now, if there are 3 different specialties which are going to be operating there, then the names of the 3 operating surgeons should be mentioned on the consent form, and all 3 specialists should be signing the consent form also. Because a neurosurgeon would not necessarily know the risk that the ENT part will entail, or the plastic surgery part will entail, and vice versa. Is it required that the principal surgeon himself or herself signs the consent form? It is a good practice if it can be done. But as a minimum, a person who will be assisting the the principal surgeon and will be part of the operating team can do that. But the name of the principal surgeon as well as name of the person who is obtaining the consent should be clearly mentioned. And as a minimum, the doctor who is the assistant or part of the operating team should be signing the consent form along with the date and time.
Yeah, that's can I add on, Dr. Narayan, to that? So
sure, please, ma'am.
Many hospitals where there are polytrauma and different teams operate, the practice is also that each team takes a separate consent, which is because a team which is operating on the abdomen, the risks are totally different from somebody who's operating on the leg for a fracture and for a facial injury or for a dental injury. So each team also takes the consent separately depending on the risks that is associated with the surgery that they are performing. So I mean, that is also another practice. So end of the day, the patient must be educated. The patient should know the risks that are associated with the procedure, the various procedures that are happening. And ultimately, it is the principal surgeon who's responsible, the admitting surgeon or the surgeon under whom the patient is primarily admitted. But yes, equally, all of them have responsibility. The wound may get better in the abdomen, but it can start infected. It can get infected at the fracture area. So end of the day, each one is different surgery. So we will need to ensure that specifically the risks are addressed. So it's probably a good practice for each of the teams to take separate consents as well. What is your thought on that, Dr. Narayan?
Absolutely right. So in the example that you gave of polytrauma, and where there are different teams who are they're operating at the same time but are actually completely unrelated to each other. In that scenario, 100% separate consents, because again, what is the requirement for consent? It is that what information is communicated and documented, that okay, this information has been given to the patient, and that essentially has to be captured. So the risks, the complications, the type of procedure, etc., are they are so different in the example which madam gave, that obviously it's best to have separate consents rather than just take the consent as one single one. In the example that I gave you, let's say operating on a skull base, the surgery is single, but there are 3 different teams which are going to be operating. So maybe in that case, one single form. What is important is that the procedure details and the complications and risk benefits alternatives get captured. Fundamentally, that is what is required. Whether 1 or 3, I think those are decisions which the hospitals can take as per their requirement.
Absolutely. So if a member of the operating team signs the consent, is it acceptable? Does the principal surgeon need to countersign the consent?
It's a good practice if the principal consultant himself takes consent. That's ideal, or at least countersigns. But as long as a member of the operating team is signing the form, the requirement is being met.
Great. So again on consent, I think shall we move out slightly away from consent now? So let's go to some amount of counseling. I think it's time that we have some counseling also. Explain on the multidisciplinary counseling, how often it has to be organized, who should be part of the team.
Right. So this is, I think, very important in today's time, because I think we alluded to this earlier also, that increasingly care is becoming quite complex, and whether one calls it subspecialty or super specialty, there are various teams and various expertise which are treating the patient simultaneously. In the example of polytrauma which madam gave, or multiple comorbidities, let's say a patient is admitted, somebody looking after the condition of the heart, somebody looking after condition of the kidney, somebody looking after the liver, and somebody neurologist looking after the brain, spine, nerves, etc. Now in that situation, now imagine the plight of the patient, because there are various doctors or experts or specialists who are coming and kind of treating, and the biggest fear is that is there adequate coordination and communication between these teams. And many of the times the patient family and the patient himself or herself feel completely lost, that there are many people coming but we really don't know what is happening. So that is where this multidisciplinary, and it's not only for doctors, I mean it's for physiotherapists and dietitians and various other this thing which also come into play. So that's where multidisciplinary team concept or a multidisciplinary counseling has come into play. Typically in patients who require complex care, who have multiple comorbidities, patients who have a relatively poor prognosis, patients who are, let's say, long stay patients who have been in the hospital for a long time, or have had multiple complications while they have stayed in the hospital, are the ones where multidisciplinary counseling is required. How frequently to do it? Again, there is no specific requirement that it has to be done in 12 hours or 24 hours, etc. But a good practice is that at least every 48 hours. In ICU, of course, it would be on a daily basis that it would be required. So it depends on the acuity of care and the patient situation. But at least every 48 hours, a multidisciplinary counseling should be done. Every 24 hours, a counseling can be done by the treating doctor or the treating team or the intensivist in the ICU, etc. Again, what is the importance? The importance is that the information is shared with the patient in a wholesome, comprehensive manner by the various teams which are treating. Who should participate in multidisciplinary counseling? People who understand the care which is being provided and the nuances of that care. So ideally, it should be the specialist himself or herself who is treating the case. If for some reason he or she may not be available, at least a person from his team or his assistant who is directly involved in patient care, that patient's care, should be the one who should be involved in multidisciplinary counseling. And it should be documented along with date, time, signature, etc. There are various hospitals, etc. If possible, to do video recordings, etc., which is over and above the requirement as a good practice which should be followed.
Thanks for that. Dr. Swati Makashir has raised a question. In a teaching hospital, can the consent be taken by a postgraduate student? The student may not have the information about the details of the procedure, so he or she may not be able to explain the details to the patient. So she's giving the scenario also there.
Yeah. So in the scenario that you have given, if the person who is taking the consent himself does not know the details of the procedure or what are the various risk, complications, etc., that person will not be able to should not take consent, because he or she is not able to convey the entire information and nor answer the queries which the patients may have. So I mean, it would be invalid on that ground.
But on a general basis, what is your opinion? Can a postgraduate take the consent? Let's say it's
If
a
the if
neurosurgery
the
registrar.
if the postgraduate is involved directly in the care, is going to be part of the operating team, then definitely can do. But then the postgraduate is also expected to have knowledge of that particular, the procedure and plan therapy, etc., and should be able to answer the relevant queries that the patient may have.
Yeah, I think that is what is most important. In your scenario, he's not aware, but
Yeah.
otherwise a postgraduate is a doctor. He's part of the operating team. So I think it's in a medical college setting, it's extremely important that we have all these questions answered as well. Now again, similar to this, if a trainee doctor does a procedure, who will sign the consent form?
So, like I said earlier, the consent form has to be signed by a member of the operating team, if not by the principal surgeon himself. Please remember the concept of captain of the ship, and that's exactly what applies to surgeons. Even if there is a trainee or somebody under the principal surgeon who is going to be operating, the overall responsibility lies with the principal surgeon. So even in the case of a trainee, it should be a member of the operating team. And if a trainee is involved, it should be clearly specified that trainee so and so with the name will be involved in the surgical procedure.
If anything untoward happens, who's the responsible? Who's responsible?
Yeah, so I think I just answered that question when I gave the analogy of a captain of the ship. Legally, the liability rests with the principal surgeon and invariably the hospital also, because the hospital is also made a party in case of any misadventure or situation like that.
Absolutely. So let's quickly go on to some aspects of confidentiality, Dr. Narayan. I have seen this practice in many hospitals, even I have seen. Each nursing station will have a whiteboard which will have details like UHID, name of the consultant, the patient who is admitted under, planned discharge, planned procedures, posted for OT, and also the patient name will be on the door and in the board. Is this practice allowed?
Well, again, see, fundamental thought is that, what is the intent of putting up a whiteboard? The fundamental intent of putting up a whiteboard is so that the information is readily available to people who need that information. Usually it is at the nursing station. So quickly, in case of any assignment, who is the assigned nurse, etc., these kind of information is there. Does a patient name need to be displayed there? Is there any benefit of putting a patient name there? I'll probably flip the question and ask. Because if the UHID is there, the room number is there, if the name of the treating consultant is there, if the estimated date of discharge is there, all the information which is relevant and required for the nursing team is available. So there is no requirement to put the patient's name up there. And there may be situations where you may specifically want to avoid putting patients' names there. There may be multiple situations. There may be a criminal case, there may be some victim, etc., where it may not be required. So there is no benefit of putting a patient name. So why display it? So it should not be displayed. As long as all the other information which is for operational requirements is there, there is no merit in putting up a patient's name there.
Yeah, it's in most hospitals it is done. It is like it's like a reminder for the nurses to follow up. Okay, this person is posted for this particular procedure whatsoever. When you have patient Lalita posted for hysterectomy, then it's a problem because someone else is going to be viewing that. Instead, as Dr. Narayan said, the intent is for follow up to make sure that procedures are happening as per what is planned. But for that, the UHID and the room number is good enough. You don't need to put the name of the patient there. As long as the intent is met, the confidentiality aspects, I think, is what they are more concerned about. Now, it says, what is privileged communication? Please elaborate.
Yeah. So, the relationship between a doctor and a patient, and it's called a therapeutic contract. And by virtue of a therapeutic contract, a medical professional or doctor is privileged to have certain, private or confidential information of the patient because that's required for clinical decision making and treatment. Let's say personality choices or lifestyle choices of a particular patient. Sexual choices of a particular patient. These are all things which maybe the doctor, by virtue of requiring that information for clinical decision making, is privy to, and that is typically what is called privileged communication. And this privileged communication, the intent is that it is only to remain between the patient and the treating doctor, and it is not shared with anybody else unless there is a specific reason to do so. For example, communicating a notifiable disease. If there is a Notifiable Diseases Act which requires you to divulge the information or share that information, then you are bound by law to do so. Similarly, if a court or a magisterial inquiry asks you about certain specific, facets of a patient's, life or situation, then you are bound to answer that. Otherwise, in ordinary situation, that information remains confidential, and that's why it is called privileged communication.
Thanks for that, Dr. Narayan. Now, there's a question from Moshmi. How do we promote patient rights actively? How do we ensure that the hospital hasn't behaved with the patients in an unacceptable manner? For example, comatose patients means. I think she wants to know what is a comatose patient.
Comatose patient, I'll maybe start with the bottom first. And comatose patient is patient is in a coma or a situation of semi-consciousness or unconsciousness, where the patient himself or herself is not able to make any decisions of any kinds, and decisions are made on behalf of the patient by the others. So that's what coma or comatose patients means. Now, how do we ensure that the hospital hasn't behaved with the patients in any unacceptable manner? So there are various ways and means of kind of ascertaining that. We have already, during the course of the PRE chapter, we have discussed about the needs for dignity of the patient during care, whether it is during examination, whether it is internal examination or various procedures, etc. Sharing any information of the patient in public areas, etc., where it is not required. Discriminating against any patient because of any reason, whether it is caste or religion or clinical condition, etc. All that is unacceptable behavior. How does one kind of get to know about it? By various ways and means. First is by doing a routine kind of a surveillance, keeping your eyes and ears open, and having a good patient feedback system, an incident reporting system, both formal as well as informal communication, by involving various people, whether it is from administration, whether it is from different fraternities like nursing, or from the medical care fraternity, or from quality and patient safety team, to be actively looking at preventing any such situation where unacceptable behavior is happening. How do we promote patients' rights? I think that overall is required to have a good patient safety and positive culture in the organization, right from the top leadership to the person at the bottom or on the actively involved in giving patient care, should be first of all aware what are patients' rights, because if people are aware, only then they will be able to follow it. So educating people about patients' rights, educating people about how to follow patients' rights, educating people with say do's and don'ts about observing patients' rights, and having a system to periodically check and monitor whether this is happening or not. I think that is the best way to promote patients' rights. Like I said, starting from the very top, and that's in fact what the objective element also states very clearly, both here in PRE as well as under ROM.
Yeah, I think Dr. Mohan has also added a couple of points here. Review of practices by peer helps, especially on the flow. Then the other thing that Dr. Saxena has added, when we take consent for blood transfusion, chemotherapy, endorsement has to be done on consent form or on treatment sheet.
So the usual practice, Dr. Saxena, is that like I said, when the first time the consent is taken, it is more elaborate and it explains all things in detail. And then on the same consent form, the endorsement can take place, because there is a link between the initial consent and the endorsement.
Yeah, I think how do we have an evidence of patient counseling?
Like I said, we need to document, any counseling sessions that we do with the patient, including signs by the people who have given the counseling and who have received the counseling. Hospitals also, quite a few of them now have started having some, dedicated space or room where counseling can be carried out. You may think of putting up a register there, which can be signed. If possible, it can be video recorded, or by means of, audio or video recording. It should be disclosed to the patients and the families very clearly, so that the communication is free and frank between them. These are some of the ways by which the counseling can be captured.
So I'll quickly go through some of the questions now, Dr. Narayan. Please highlight on the criteria for setting up infringement of patients and family rights.
Yeah, so I think during the course of the discussion, we have taken quite a few examples, like whether the names or the privilege, communication, for example, is being shared, or patient dignity, for example, is not being maintained. These are all examples where patients' rights are being infringed. If the communication is not being shared completely with the patient's, family, or the patient himself or herself. If, for example, the consent-taking practices is suboptimal, if they are not being involved, if their wishes and choices are not being asked and catered for both in the care plan as well as in some of the other activities. These are all examples where patients' rights are being infringed upon. Similarly, even at the time of admission, for example, financial harm is also a type of patient harm, and it's required that we do proper counseling for the patients about some of the charges, what are included, excluded, etc. So all those, if they are not being followed properly, are examples where rights are being infringed.
That's a
Not providing medical records, for example.
exactly. I think that's a good one, the financial harm. So that's something to look up into. Explain some viewpoints on handling the sensitive confidential information in minor patients.
So minors, by virtue of their age and immaturity, are also considered, practically as vulnerable, patients. The information regarding minors should only be shared with their legal guardians, parents, or whoever else in situation might be. And also, even in that case, there may be certain times where discretion may be required. There may be instances of abuse, there may be instances of molestations, etc. I'm just giving some sordid examples, but these examples we do see from time to time in hospitals. So at that time, one has to be very careful. Any information about minors should not be shared by anybody who is not concerned. It should only be shared with the parent or the legal guardian, and with nobody else. Whoever, however many times, may request, no, I am the uncle or the aunt or whatever, and we are very close. By good practice and law, it should only be shared with the legal guardian or the parent. Even the medical records, in case procedures, etc., are carried out, there is a specific requirement, particularly in adolescents and children, that the record should be kept till the child attains maturity and 3 years after that. So effectively, it means till the time the child reaches 21 years of age.
Thanks for that. I think there are questions on pain management techniques. Do you want to take that, Dr. Narayan? Elaborate on long-term pain management techniques, which is given for non-treatable underlying condition. Is there any specific documentation and strategies to be followed?
So per se, the pain management and long-term pain management would come under, care of patients rather than under PRE. But what is important is to engage and involve the patient in the decision making about what are the types of pain management therapies or pain alleviation techniques which can be there. What are the pros and cons of each one of them? Let's say, for example, use of opioid medicines, etc. So that should be communicated clearly to the patient. Their wishes should be sought, and accordingly, pain management techniques or therapy should be put into place. That is most important, rather than the type of pain management, because that's a clinical decision and it has to be made on case-to-case basis.
Dr. Mohan Adhyam has added a point about the minor thing that we talked about, the previous one. Any information about a minor that may lead to abuse, exploitation, or violence should be considered privileged information. Assent could be taken from the child if the child can understand. You
Absolutely.
want to add on anything? Yeah.
No, so sometimes, like I said, depending on the situation, let's say a special child, somebody with Down syndrome, etc. Now, the age of the child may be, practically like an adult, but may not be able to understand, let's say good touch, bad touch, etc. There are various, instances which can happen. So sharing any information of this kind, which can lead to potential, abuse or exploitation, should be done very, very carefully, only when needed and only with whom it is needed. Sometimes, like I was giving the example, there domestic abuse or child abuse, etc., may be happening through somebody who is practically the next of kin, or sometimes even parents or siblings, etc. So these are nuances which need to be kept in mind when exchanging information.
Yeah. Then
Unfortunately, we cannot be very prescriptive on this because it really depends on the sensitivity of the case.
True. It has to be on a case-to-case basis. I think that's very, very important. If a patient's relative does not want to resuscitate the patient or do any life-saving procedure, without which he may not survive, withholding the same will lead to legal implications or not.
So there is an entire judgment and act now which deals with the DNR and the right to withhold, etc. And I think it is best referred to that because it's a separate topic in itself, and we will not be able to justice to that. But what is important to realize is that at no point in time anything can violate the law of the land. If the law of the land is very clear that this is to be done or not to be done, only that has to be followed. The courts and the law has given certain provisions which need to be followed in case a living will, etc., is to be made. There are various ways and means of doing that. In a nutshell, a patient's relative cannot decide on behalf of the patient, specifically when it comes to withdrawing or mandates like do not resuscitate. There's an entire legal dimension to it, and it is best referred to under that text.
Thank you. I think with that we come to the end of all the questions that have come to us, but there are a couple of other questions. Let's just take 5 minutes, Doctor.
Sure.
I know we are holding you, but just a couple of interesting questions here. As per the law, whether the pre-printed informed consents or written consents are acceptable. So I think it's with that latest...
there was a judgment in Punjab recently. Yeah. So I think the jury is still out as far as that is concerned. Again, what is important? What is important is that the information, number one, should be comprehensively captured and communicated and documented. Now, is it fair that a pre-printed form is, let's say signed in advance by the doctor or whoever is concerned and handed over to the patient? That would be a strict, and gross violation. I think we all agree to that. The ideal practice which many of the medico-legal, experts, they advocate is that a consent is ideal if it is in the patient's own handwriting, if it can be taken. Fantastic. But is it operationally achievable? Extremely difficult, because if you think, nowadays the requirements in a consent information includes what is, briefly describing the technique of the procedure, what is going to happen, what are the specific complications and risks. Sometimes the risks are quantitative. They are also based on various comorbidities, patient factors, etc. Is it possible for the patient to understand and write everything in his or her own handwriting onto this and sign? I think that's practically, extremely difficult, challenging, if not impossible. So pre-printed forms are the norm. Like I said, the jury is still out, and I'm sure there will be more discussions among the legal eagles on this specific, judgment which came out from one of the consumer courts in Punjab. But the practice currently is that pre-printed forms are acceptable, provided the act of, information exchange, communication, and consent taking also follows the good consent practice and is signed and, by all the concerned individual, the patient, the doctor, and the witness.
So there I think we are clear on that. Let's not get into that into great detail, because there it is very specific to that particular case. If you look at it, there the consent was like a general consent, and that included the surgical consent also along with that. So it is very specific to that situation, is what I understand. Anyway, most important is...
So the term blanket consent, sorry to interrupt you, but, in fact, in NABH also, 4th edition, and even earlier we have talked about that, blanket consents anyway are not acceptable, that you cannot put everything under one consent and say simply because the patient has signed means it's acceptable.
Actually, yes. Now, do we need separate form to document patient's refusal for treatment?
Sorry, can you repeat that, please?
Do we need separate form to document patient's refusal for treatment?
Separate form, if you can have a separate form, it's definitely, recommended. Even if a separate form is not there, the same needs to be documented. It may be documented in the patient's case file. that this is the therapy or the procedure or the treatment that the patient is advised, and the patient is not willing or does not want to follow X, Y, or Z, and the signature of the treating doctor or the person who has explained, and preferably of the patient, if the patient is in a condition to sign and to take a decision, or the relative or next of kin should be taken on the refusal of treatment. It's best if you could have a separate form, but what is important is the specifics of that case and that refusal are captured. That is most important.
This is from Dr. Devanti. A girl who's a major coming for abortion without any attendant. Do they have a right to undergo this? How can hospital treat without any attendant?
So I think we are moving into the medical legal space rather than on patients' rights and education. As per law, and this is my understanding of the law, and I'm happy to be corrected on that. Any adult of sound mind is the person who himself or herself should be able to take the decision of his or her health choices. So there is no reason to deny somebody that opportunity.
Yeah, I think we leave with that because there are far too many questions like this. If a major girl is unmarried, do parents have a right to get info about their daughter's condition or decision making of getting an MPP? I think if she's a major girl, let's leave her alone. Yeah.
So please remember we are talking about patient rights. That's what the chapter. I think Dr. Mohan has some comment on that particular case.
Yeah. He says no. Yeah.
So like I said, I mean, I think we are moving away from the ambit of patient rights and education into strictly medico-legal affairs. And those require a special, a different session to maybe not even one session. In fact, it may require multiple sessions. And even there, the opinion changes, many times. And it's still evolving, many of these, things, because different complex scenarios keep emerging. Life and death was a simple matter earlier. I think no longer the case, because even the viability of the fetus and the time to abort, etc., keeps, it's underwent a recent change. The death earlier used to be a simple death. Now there are various types of death. There's circulatory death and brain death and God knows how many types. So the legal framework also follows and evolves from time to time. But what is important is for us to be aware of what the legal requirements are and follow them.
Dr. Devanti, I think that brings us to a very interesting webinar probably that we should be hosting very soon on medical legal aspects, and we should probably be able to answer to all those questions. And coming to another important question, objective element on general consent is removed in 5th edition. Should we continue taking general consent? This is from Dr. Pallavi.
So a general consent is actually more like it's more like an undertaking. It's more like a general undertaking that patient is being admitted on his or her own will, and that they will follow the hospital's policies and procedures, etc. That general consent is not it's not specific for any type of care or any particular procedure which has to be carried out. By nature, it is general. I think there is merit in it to be continued. You don't have to necessarily go by whether the NABH specifically talks about a general consent or not, because it's important at the time of admission to capture this and to document this. So it's a good practice and can be continued.
I agree with Dr. Narayan. It's something that we have all implemented. It's a good practice. It's a consent when the patient comes into the hospital. Let's just continue with it. I don't think we'll have to do away with it. We are not following something because it was prescriptive, right? That added value to what we were doing. So I think we should just go ahead and continue with it. For want of time, I think we'll have to close with this, Dr. Narayan. I really appreciate your time. You are in Sri Lanka and answering to all our questions from a resort. You have a great time with your family there. And thank you, dear friends, for joining for this very interesting question and answer session. Would really thank you all for all the wonderful questions, 32 questions that you put together. This will be recorded and it will be shared to all the other 600 participants. If there are more questions, we can share with Dr. Narayan, and I'm
of course
sure, yeah. Dr. Narayan, you want to add on?
No, just to conclude, I think we had a great session. Thank you for the questions, very enriching. And like you would have observed that, there are many places where there may be difference of opinions or difference in practice. Ultimately, it is the intent and spirit which is most important. and we all collectively share, collectively learn, and collectively improve. I think that's the spirit of any quality journey and accreditation process. So I'll be happy to, if there are questions, I know there are quite a few questions. So, please feel free to share, and to the best of my capability, I'll be happy to answer them.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Kaho team, Dr. Sakshi, Meenakshi, Vaishnavi, for all the efforts that you're putting in. Thank you all participants. So the next week, we will go live with HIC. Dr. Sanjeev Singh and Dr. J. Jayalakshmi will be handling the HIC session, after which we'll have the Q&A session the following week. Have a wonderful weekend and a great week ahead. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you. Bye-bye.